Thank you very much for those words of introduction, Lauren. Thank you for the words on behalf of IRI. I am Jim Kolbe, a former member of Congress, a board member of the International Republican Institute, and have the great privilege and honor to moderate this session this afternoon with some very, very distinguished people who have a great deal of knowledge about national security and foreign policy, and I think will be very enlightening to you. As Lauren said, we welcome all of you here, but especially our international guests, who we hope find this process of this political nominating convention interesting. We've been following this process as it has gone through this spring, and now we're at the final step of the selection process. From here on, it's a sprint to the finish line in November. But I hope at the end of this week, you'll go away with an understanding of how this convention becomes an important part of the entire campaign. Before I go further, might I ask all of our audience, if you would, to put your cell phones on silence or turn them off so that we don't have disruptions during the course of the session here this afternoon. I think we would all agree up here on this panel that in the United States in this election this year, economic policy is going to be the overriding issue. And that's true, I think, in most places around the world today, as we see a world that has been struggling to right itself and to get economies moving again, to get growth going forward. And yet, no political party and certainly no presidential candidate can afford to ignore foreign policy. As we know from past experience, to ignore foreign policy is to invite some kind of disaster, or something bad may happen as a result of that. I remember very well in the year 2000 moderating a session like this in Philadelphia. And of course, at that time, while we talked about many foreign policy issues, no one could have foreseen what happened just a year later on the events of 9/11, September 11th, 2001. So this afternoon, this panel is going to focus on how a Romney administration might change some of the directions of our foreign policy. How might it be different? What would be the hallmarks of a Romney foreign policy? These are the questions we want to discuss today. We're not here primarily to focus on the failures of President Obama, though of course the differences will highlight what we would think would be the things that have been done incorrectly, perhaps. But we're here mainly to talk about how the foreign policy might change and what the differences might be. We have four very distinguished panelists here. There was supposed to be a fifth one, David Dreyer, my colleague, former colleague from the House of Representatives, but as chairman of the Rules Committee in the House, he is also the chief parliamentarian for the convention and needed to be on the floor for the opening session this afternoon. So we have four very distinguished panelists, and let me just say at the outset, the Republican Party does believe in gender diversity. We did have and hope to have Senator Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire with us, but she also has been taken away by some other events. Let me just introduce them in the order that I see them sitting here, going from down at the other end of the table. We have Senator...
If Senator Ayotte...
Leave it on.
It would also have brought down the average age of this panel. We believe in age diversity also.
That's true, but some of us are still very young here, Jim. Let me just introduce them very briefly. You have in your descriptions of their biography, so I'm not going to go through them in any great length. At the one end down here, we have former Senator Norm Coleman, who served in the Senate from 2003 to 2009. He's now a senior advisor at Hogan Lovells. In the Senate, he served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, and has been a longtime advocate for international assistance programs. Next to him is Senator Jim Kolbe, who was a member of the House of Representatives from 1993 to 2001, and then in the U.S. Senate from 2002 to 2007. He was a member of the Armed Services Committee, both in the House and in the Senate, and was certainly known as a key player in 1994 and 1995, I should say, 96, on the welfare reform legislation in the House of Representatives. He's currently a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Next to him, we have another one of my former colleagues here, Congressman Vin Weber, who served in the House of Representatives from 1981 to 1993, and he served, as I did, on the Appropriations Committee. He's a co-founder of Clark & Weinstock, which is a public policy and business consulting group, has been a prominent strategist and, I might say, intellectual guide for the Republican Party, particularly on foreign affairs, and serves on many boards and commissions in Washington, most notably the National Endowment for Democracy until the year 2009, and currently on the Secretary of Defense Policy Board. Finally, we have Ambassador Rich Williamson, who is a partner in the international law firm of Winston & Strawn. He has a wide range of government experience in the Reagan White House as a special assistant. He was ambassador of our ambassador to the United Nations offices in Vienna. He's been Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations. I served with him as a trustee both for the International Republican Institute and of Freedom House, and he's the author of well over 100 articles and 7 books, so somebody else that is a key person, and I might add the head of Governor Romney's foreign policy advisory team. So that's our line. Having been given, as you came in, question cards. We're going to be having some discussion up here, a dialogue, we hope, conversation, back and forth with questions and talking with each other about some of these issues. But you'll have some things that you want to ask questions about. Please write those questions down on a piece, on the card that you've been given, and pass them towards the aisle. I think it's on the edges, I guess it is, here. Pass them towards the aisles, and at 3 o'clock, what I would consider to be a general question. And I'd like each of you to give me your elevator speech. That is your 30-second speech. You've gotten in the elevator with somebody and they said, so how is President Romney going to be different from President Obama on foreign policy? So rather than just go into the specifics of what it would be in China or Middle East or anything, just in general, how would you see the foreign policy of a President Romney as being different from the current foreign policy? And we'll go right down the line on this, so we'll start here with Rich.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, IRI, Lauren Greener and Judy Van Rest, and one of our board members, Connie Newman. It's always a pleasure to be with Vin, Norm, and Jim Talent. I think it's the basic principles that are different is, unlike President Obama, who feels that America is exceptional in the same way as he said that Greeks feel Greece is exceptional, and British feel Britain is exceptional. Governor Romney recognizes that American exceptionalism is based on the principles that founded our country, the first country founded on principles of human rights and democracy, and that's been the shiny city on the hill, not only for us, but for all the world. Second, he feels strongly that America should lead. We are better off as a country when America leads, and the world's better off, and we have no apologies for that. In contrast, President Obama, as Dave Sanger's book makes clear, and many others, seeks a risk avoidance, which sometimes allows events to just unfold and hope for the best. The dangers of that are seen in the growing threat of nuclear breakout in Iran and the death, destruction, and dismay that's going on in Syria. 3, we've had a bipartisan tradition of peace through strength, from Harry Truman to John Kennedy to Ronald Reagan. Mitt Romney embraces that tradition. President Obama and Jimmy Carter are the 2 outliers who feel, for whatever reason, that is not the principle on which our foreign policy should be based. And as Kevin Eberthal, a Democrat who headed up the China work in the NSC for Bill Clinton, has written regarding China, President Obama thought his ideas and eloquence would bend China's behavior. The Chinese found that curious and looked to their interests. So President Romney will be in the tradition of peace through strength, leadership, acceptance of our unique role. He will believe in engagement, but won't allow the Security Council to determine how we pursue our vital interests. And he will be willing to negotiate and engage, but in the end he won't lose track of what our principal objective is, which is security and liberty.
Thank you, Rich. Let's go to Vin.
Thank you very much. I just endorse what Ambassador Williamson said. I would begin by saying that when Jim introduced us, he mentioned that I'm a former chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy, and Norm Coleman and I continue to serve on the board of the NED and have had the opportunity over the years to work very closely with Lauren and Judy and IRI, and there isn't really a finer organization or group of people. It strikes me in response to Jim's question, thinking about that. I was in the Congress when we voted to establish the National Endowment for Democracy, a tribute to Ronald Reagan's leadership, but also a tribute to a bipartisan consensus that America was indeed an exceptional nation. That's why this organization exists. That's why the NED was founded. It's why the National Democratic Institute exists, because we believe we are a special nation with special obligations. It's sad to me that that is even in question with this administration or any other, but it is in question. And I think that's a question that will be answered when President Romney is inaugurated, because he has a firm belief that America does have a special role to play in the world and in history. And in that regard, he's going to make it clear that America wants to lead, intends to lead, and will be a dependable and reliable ally to our friends.
Jim Talent.
Yeah, I would also affirm that, maybe a slightly different slant on it. First of all, those in the audience who haven't and who are interested ought to read the first couple of chapters of Governor Romney's book, No Apology, The Case for American Greatness, because he lays out this historical view that Rich and Vin have referred to. And I mean, he affirms his belief in this tradition that emerged in the post-war era when Harry Truman, who was the only president from Missouri, working with leaders in the other party, made a very deliberate decision to move America from a secondary role outside of the Western Hemisphere into the forefront of world events. Not to dominate or dictate, but to work on the basis of cooperation with other countries that had similar objectives and values in order to anticipate, contain, diffuse conflict before it broke out into the major kind of engagements and wars that we had just experienced over the preceding 25 years. One of the operating principles of that policy is the United States maintains robust capabilities, both in hard and soft power, that we nurture our traditional alliances and try and build other partnerships, and then as Vin and Rich have said, we lead. I mean, we anticipate, we get out front, we try to be proactive. And really, if you look at what's happened in the last 3.5 years, and I mean this with all due respect, you have seen not just decisions that we may disagree with, but a repudiation of that post-war strategic framework. And the consequences of that are immense, and we're beginning to experience them now. We'll probably talk about them in answer to specific questions.
If I can, Jim, let me have one additional element that will highlight a difference, and that is, under President Romney, the United States foreign policy will operate under a strong economic foundation. It's very tough to provide credible counsel to Europe about debt crisis when America is not handling its own debt problems. It's tough to lead in terms of hard and soft power when you don't have a firm economic base. Mitt Romney brings unique capability, capacity to solving the economic problems the United States has. He's 25 years in the private sector. He's often fond of saying that to grow a job, it helps to have had a job. And he's grown 100,000 jobs in his work in the private side with American icon businesses, Domino's, Sports Authority, a range of important businesses that have created jobs throughout this country. So that economic base is, and you can hear through the campaign, this campaign is going to be about jobs, 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 and then the next issue is going to be about jobs. But the reality is, in order to have a strong military, in order to exercise soft power, you have to deal with the economic challenges, Mitt Romney will deal with those challenges, will deal with them effectively, and as a result, I think we'll be much more effective in the foreign policy realm.
Well, thank you. That question kind of leads into a second one along the same lines, maybe to get a little bit more specific, and we'll start coming back the other direction this time. But President Obama has said from time to time that, or it seems that his view from the things he said, is that the world wants a less dominant United States and a somewhat more constrained foreign policy. Yet in some regions like the Middle East and in Asia, some of our friends are complaining that the United States is not leading forcefully enough to ensure peace and security in those areas. When it comes to the balance of power in the world, but particularly in those areas, is the U.S. better off taking a hands-off role or leading much more vigorously? And if it's the latter, how do we do that and not at the same time come off with looking as though we're trying to of our partners and our allies around the world in this? So we'll start with you, Norm, about that.
If I can, just to tell a quick story. I was in the United States Senate when we voted to admit 7 of the European nations, Baltics and others, into NATO. So Bulgaria, Slovenia, Slovakia, I don't know if I remember the whole list, Lithuania, Romania, etc. And I remember, by the way, standing with Dick Luke next to me, and he said this was his, I don't know, 1,600 something vote, and he showed in the galleries with the ambassadors for these countries, and he said, this is another vote to me, but to the folks standing up there, it's one of the most important votes that I've ever taken. President Bush told the story then about conversation in NATO, where there was a discussion. He was with this is shortly after the accession of these countries into NATO, and there was a discussion about NATO military jets flying over. And at the end of the conversation, he noted how, and I believe it was the leaders from Poland and a couple other countries came up to him and thanked him. They thanked him. I think people respect American leadership. Also, our foreign policy on Syria to Kofi Annan, which the Washington Post, and that is not a conservative publication, or I guess from abroad, labeled that diplomatic effort as one of the worst disasters in the history of UN diplomacy. And that says a mouthful. And so I think the world, I think our allies are going to want us to lead. I think it's important for us to lead. And I think when we fail to lead, there are terrible consequences. And with Governor Romney, we will lead in an appropriate way that will be respected and appreciated by our friends, our allies, and by the way, respected by those who are not our allies.
Yeah, Jim, I know you don't necessarily want each of us to respond to every question, although we're very capable of
this first one is certainly the first couple of ones I do want to
and I think the key here is leadership. It's a balance, and the United States wants, needs allies, partners, other countries that will work with us either on a broad spectrum of issues or in some cases on discrete issues. And I think you get more of that kind of burden sharing, stronger alliances, once America demonstrates its commitment and its presence. I think this is an arrangement, an international arrangement to which most of the world has become accustomed, and I think most people understand, and most governments understand, that it's American initiative and leadership leaves a broad room for action by allies, friends, partners, and work things out. And there are many examples of that we could give. But where you don't have demonstrated American leadership, you get, in particular parts of the world, you don't necessarily get other countries stepping up and working together. What you often get is greater division and drift and rising conflict. So it has to be done appropriately. Governor Romney understands that. And I should say about him, though, by the way, this is a man who has traveled very extensively around the world, who knows an awful lot of people, and who learns and listens everywhere he goes. And those in the audience who have met him or been in groups that have shared and dialogued with him know that is very much the case. And he is deeply interested in foreign policy, very concerned about it, and I think will be a very proactive president.
Thank you, Vin.
I think Jim said it exactly right. I think an unfortunate dichotomy developed in the Bush administration years that sort of pitted unilateralism against multilateralism. And it's led to the thinking that if you argue for a stronger U.S. role in the world, for more leadership by the United States, this is somehow at odds with alliances, multilateral organizations. And exactly the opposite is true. Our alliances, multilateral organizations, international financial organizations, are all stronger, are all more capable of doing their jobs if the United States is fully engaged and provides the leadership. We are the only ones with the resources to provide that leadership. And those organizations that will be better served if we provide stronger leadership, as opposed to having that leadership questioned, as I think it has become questioned in the course of the last 4 years.
Rich?
Of course, I align with all the points made before. I'd just like to elaborate slightly. I think, as Vin said, there's been a false dichotomy between multilateralism and unilateralism, a cartoonish aspect. The Vice President, who apparently spends most of his time out making kind of silly attacks on the campaign trail, likes to draw these contrasts. The fact is, as the guests in this room know, there's not an A or a Z, there's a lot in between. Of course, the United States should be reasonable and rational, responsive. Of course, the United States should be practical and pragmatic and proportional. Of course, as the largest power in the world, the United States should cooperate and coordinate and collaborate and compromise. Yes, we want to work with others, and we can. But the American toolbox in foreign policy is large, larger than any other country's. And we're going to use the full range of those tools in collaboration with our friends and others. It doesn't mean we always agree. The smartest person I know is here today. It's my wife, Jane, and we don't agree, which shows how stupid I am. You don't always agree even with your good friends, but you try to work together and understand. And one of the things that's been unfortunate is many of our allies in the Middle East, Europe, and elsewhere feel there has not been that sort of collaboration, coordination, and support over the last years of this administration. We're stronger when we work with others, and we're going to continue to do so. At the same time, when U.S. has vital interests at stake, it's not going to play Mother May I with the Security Council, where a country that might have other strategic interests will stop the United States from doing what it must, as we've seen in the context of Syria and the intransigence of Moscow. And the cost of the Obama administration saying that they had to go through the Security Council was a placeholder to avoid real leadership, was posture, not policy, was activity, not action. 17,000 innocent people plus have died, many of them horrifically. And those who have different strategic interests in the region are benefiting as we sit on the sidelines. So it's a good example, and Governor Romney's been clear on his position, where the U.S. should provide leadership. And in this instance, the Arab League, many of our European allies, are people with whom we could work with and should be working with. So Mitt Romney's not a unilateralist. He understands thoroughly it's better to work with others. He will do that. He will rebuild our relation with our closest allies. He'll reach out to work with others. And for those who have fundamental differences of opinion with the U.S., we'll talk and try to find areas of common cooperation.
Jim, if I may, I'm just going to follow up on something that Rich said, and perhaps a little more conversational, kind of go back and forth. But look at Syria. That one of the realities that my friend Al Khalilzad used the phrase "coalition of the relevant." We need to kind of pull that together. But the challenge we're facing is that with some of those folks in that coalition of the relevant are questioning America's resolve, and as a result, it becomes more difficult to kind of pull together this multilateral approach, because their friends in the region are looking and saying, "Are you going to bail out? Are you going to be there when we need you?" And so the lack of leadership has consequences that in the end make it more difficult to kind of form the multilateral coalitions that you need to really solve the problem.
If we contrast this with what happened in Bosnia in the 90s, for example, I was a young congressman at the time, and I think initially President Clinton tried to stay out of that and not to have the United States involved. The UN apparatus broke down, again, because of Russia. And the European countries were very desirous, this is the Kosovo situation, of America becoming involved. And we did. And he organized a coalition of the relevant and solved the issue. It wasn't easy, but he did that. And so we talk about a bipartisan tradition. That's what we're talking about. I'm going to contrast that with what's happening in Syria.
Well, that's a good point then. I wanted to turn to some of the specific areas of the region. Syria is certainly a good one to start with. We now have a civil war that's been ongoing for, well, 16, 17 months now. It's just drags on and gets worse and worse, and more people are dying than ever before. And now it's seeming to engulf countries in the region, such as Lebanon. 3 times the United States has failed to get a resolution from the United Nations to authorize tougher sanctions and a deadline for Assad to abandon his rule and what he's doing, the killing of his own people. And I think just now, recently, this last day or two, President Alana has called for recognizing the Syrian Provisional Government. Should we be doing that? Should we do that? Or what should be the specific actions we might take now if we had President Romney in the White House? Let me start with you, Bill.
Well, I think that President Hollande has sort of pointed in the direction that we, as a country, have wanted to go for a long time. We just haven't exerted any leadership in that area. It's, as a Republican, I'm not delighted to see a socialist elected president of France, but you've got to give him credit for showing some leadership in a situation in which the United States has not provided such leadership.
Anybody else want to comment on the specifics of what we might do and be doing in Syria? Rich?
I think it's important to reiterate and important for people to understand the contrasting approach of a President Romney versus a President Obama. Romney called for us to send assets into Syria and begin to work with the opposition to identify the moderates, to help them organize. We appreciate the fact that only 13 months after Governor Romney suggested that Barack Obama followed his advice, but 17,000 people have died. Governor Romney has called for arming the moderate opposition for months, and we're glad that finally the President signed a directive allowing some of the neighboring countries to do that. Again, it would have been better if he did it sooner. Allowing things to drift do not mean they'll be solved. Allowing things to drift, hoping, crossing your fingers, holding your breath, doesn't mean it's going to get better. In fact, it's gotten worse. The dangers are worse. The risks to our interests, to the neighbors. Turkey has over 50,000 refugees, some with radical elements in it. The vacuum the United States allowed to exist led Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations to rush in the breach. Iraq, Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, these are good friends of ours who rightly can say, where has the United States of America been? And the answer, unfortunately, has been missing in action.
Well, did you want to add something to that, Norm?
I was going to say, just when we talk about our leadership, our engagement, we're not talking about boots on the ground. I think that's important. But the reality is that when vacuums exist, they get filled. And so if you don't have a seat at the table, if you don't have greater engagement, then the bloodshed accelerates. The bad guys have greater ability to take control. And by the time we get to Governor Romney being able to deal with Syria, the problem has gotten much worse, and it makes it more difficult to solve. Again, I want to make clear, we're not talking about putting American troops on the ground in Syria, but we are talking about engagement. We are talking about working with, carefully identifying a moderate opposition, carefully. But the failure to do so only exacerbates the problem.
There's a good principle. I mean, the right decisions expand your options as time goes on, and the wrong decisions narrow it. So, and this is what Rich was referring to, had we engaged, identified the elements that were agitating for change, determined which ones really wanted constitutional democratic government, supported those, kept our commitments, maintained our credibility, and then used those connections in the right way with a coalition of the relevant to lay out what the vision should be for these various reform movements, which is not a new government that is just as oppressive as the old, but in different ways, but is in fact a new government that moves towards democracy and the recognition of basic rights. Now that would have been a way of not only acquiring influence over events for the United States and its allies, but also moving these parts of the world in a constructive direction and affirming American credibility. It had nothing to do with the use of military force at all, but simply an engagement. But it was, when you're leading from behind, and let's face it, that's what the administration's been doing, you don't have any control over events. I tell you this, I said before that as this strategic framework's been de facto repudiated, the consequences are immense, and we're seeing this now in that part of the world. You mentioned yourself the concerns now about Lebanon, and what is going to emerge there? What is emerging in Egypt? You probably ask questions there. And again, it's largely, we believe, in Governor Romney, because of the vacuum of American leadership.
Well, good place to turn then to what is the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East, and that's Iran and its drive for nuclear weapons. I think some credit has to be given to the Obama administration for devising some pretty tough economic sanctions and getting other countries to adhere to them, but it hasn't worked. It hasn't led to them stopping their drive for nuclearization at all. What can we do? What should be the policy today with regard to Iran? And I'm just...
One thing to start the discussion, everybody I'm sure will want to weigh in on this.
Okay, we'll let you start.
This administration has said many of the right things, but if you talk to people in the region, the emphasis is very clear. This administration says, oh yes, all options, including military options, are on the table. Talking to folks from the region, as well as experts who read the Iranian press, that's not the message that comes through. The message that comes through is the administration is working feverishly to prevent an Israeli attack on Iran. That's very different. That tells the Iranians that however much you may say the military option is on the table, at the end of the day, we don't want it to be on the table.
So do we need red lines in the sand? I'll let you go, Rich. You were anxious to respond, I can see.
Well, I'm first anxious to respond to the sanctions issue, because I'm delighted we have tougher sanctions. But I will note, first of all, President Obama and this White House opposed those sanctions in the Senate. Bipartisan leadership of Senator Menendez and Senator Mark Kirk stood up to the president and got Congress overwhelmingly to pass it. So those, with all due respect, and I hate to ever disagree with Jim Kolbe, who want to give credit to the Obama administration for that, it has to be noted that they didn't want to do this, and they opposed it.
I guess what I was saying was that I think some credit goes to the fact that the way they've implemented and worked with allies around the world to make them happen.
Well, the second thing I'd say is, when I was the President's Special Envoy to Sudan, we could not get certain sanctions to the Security Council because one of the veto wielding members got 6% of its imported oil from Sudan. We got what we could through the UN, but then we went and worked with the European Union, we worked with Arab states, we worked with countries in Southeast Asia to apply financial restrictions that crowded and made more difficult Omar al-Bashir's government. The point is, on sanctions, I'm glad we've done it. It's too bad we don't have a sense of what their effect would be and if they've been in for a long time. Second, this administration has an approach of engagement. You may remember that Hillary Clinton attacked President Obama in the campaign 4 years ago for a naive approach. He pursued that approach on engagement. As all four of us have said, Mitt Romney believes in talking to people trying to cooperate, but it's not for engagement's sake. So you have the President of the United States making a statement in February of 2009 in Farsi to the Iranian people. Fine. In June, you have a presidential election that was not free nor fair. You had tens, then hundreds of thousands of people in the Green Revolution go into the streets. They were beaten, arbitrarily arrested, demonstrators, men and women raped, and some beaten to death, including the famous video of Nadia. Our government was quiet. Its response was muted. In Tehran, they can read this. And even as this was going on, there were outreaches for engagement. So yes, they don't think that we ever are going to be truly tough. Furthermore, there have been suspensions of IAEA inspectors because of prohibitions by Tehran repeatedly in the last 3.5 years. And the US has taken a relatively quiet approach. Furthermore, we now know they not only have increased their centrifuges and have been enriching at 3.5%, but have enriched at 5%. And we've even, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, have some uranium enriched to 20%. They've come out and said they want a nuclear submarine. No statement from Washington. Some of our European colleagues raised concerns. We're now engaged in some talks that began in April that have gone nowhere, as Governor Romney predicted. And it's a holding pattern, because in Tehran, they believe in the open mic policy of Barack Obama. Wait till after the election when I'll have more flexibility.
So, I'm going to call on the other two of you for an answer to this, but let's bring it back to, we are where we are now. All the things Rich said, they are certainly correct. But we are where we are. So, post-inauguration or post-election, during a transition period, all of you are going to be called on to give advice to a President-elect Romney or a President Romney. What steps should we be taking now with regard to Iran? Jim, Norm?
The Governor Romney has proposed, for example, stationing additional American naval assets in the Eastern Mediterranean, building the missile defense system as quickly as possible, tightening up the sanctions as much as you can, as quickly as you can, supporting dissident elements, and sending a consistent and strong message in an organized way with I love that, coalitions of the relevant, that it truly is unacceptable and for them to acquire nuclear capability. Don't negotiate towards things like, well, it's okay if you have the enriched material as long as you don't have it in bomb. I mean, act in a manner that is consistent with what you have said about how unacceptable it is for them to get that capability, and do it with as many nations as possible, as quickly and as consistently as possible. This is what we need to do, and what we should have been doing all along, because really it's the credibility of the international deterrent, if you will, that's at stake here. And the United States needs to lead in asserting that, while making clear that all options are on the table, and being real about that. I would also say that if, more broadly speaking, Governor Romney will take action to show that the United States is willing to reassert that bipartisan strategic framework, its role in that I talked about earlier, which I think will have very salutary effects all over the world. So, for example, he's announced that he's going to increase American naval shipbuilding by 50%. Now, that is a way of saying that the United States is going to continue playing the role it has played in the post-war era, along with its partners, in order to support an emerging international order that's moving towards freedom and democracy. And I think that will have all of that a beneficial effect in showing the credibility of America and its partners in that part of the world.
I agree with that. We all support sanctions. We support the toughest sanctions we can get. But the logic of sanctions presumes that Iran cares more about the well-being of its people at the end of the day than it does about acquiring a nuclear weapon. That is not clear. That is far from clear. Probably is the only thing that might ultimately change them or divert them. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to have an attack on Iran. But if they don't think that there's any military option available, there's just no evidence that this government is going to be moved by economic sanctions, even if they impose great suffering on their own people.
And I can just add 2 points. One, we should remind ourselves on why this is such an issue. It's an issue because of the concern about proliferation. If the Iranians get a nuclear, what are the Saudis going to do? What are the Egyptians going to do? The world will be a much more dangerous place for all of us. It's not just an Israel problem or a United States problem. This is a global issue. Iran is the single, most significant state sponsor of supporting terrorism. And you have a nation which is called leadership, which is called the destruction of Israel, now in possession of nuclear. What does that mean? And so the consequences of Iran getting nuclear weapon are quite severe for all of us, and you really have to have a posture that says it can't be allowed to happen. It has to be understood and respected. And many of us reflect in this country on what happened with the election of Ronald Reagan. Iran takes over the U.S. Embassy during the Carter years. Ronald Reagan gets elected. On the day he gets elected, the day he gets sworn in, excuse me, the day he gets sworn in, the day he gets sworn in after the election, the day he gets sworn in, the hostages are released. I think it's important that folks understand that Governor Romney is serious about Iran not having a nuclear weapon. But for not just as an American problem, a problem for all of us. And my hope would be that after a Romney election, perhaps even before the day he's sworn in, that folks understand that Iran having a nuclear weapon will not be tolerated by the civilized world.
And the idea here, these strong leadership actions backed up by robust capabilities exercised within alliance frameworks. The object here is not to be in a position to win some military conflict. The object here is to preserve the peace, deter aggression without that kind of a conflict. And Governor Romney's referred often to the fact that when the United States built up its strength in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, of all the decades of the Cold War, it was the one in which we deployed the least around the world and had the fewest conflicts. Reagan used to say, of the 4 wars that have occurred in my lifetime, none has happened because America was too strong. So remember what the object of the strength is, and so Governor Romney believes very strongly. We've been deploying a lot while allowing our capabilities gradually to decline, and that's taken a real nosedive down under President Obama. Now again, we are where we are at now, and we don't have as many options as we would have had if we had exercised stronger leadership over the course of the last few years.
We'll come back to the issue of our defense posture and defense budget here towards the end. Before I go to the next question, let me remind everybody to please write their questions down. If your card hasn't been picked up, it should be passed to the center or to the aisles, and make sure it's waved and somebody will pick it up. So we're going to be going to those questions very quickly. Let me just ask a question, a very specific question. President Obama set a firm withdrawal date of 2014 from Afghanistan. Will Governor Romney or President Romney adhere to that, or how should we alter our policy in that regard? Jim, let me turn to you.
Yeah, we have a 2014 date. Governor Romney believes it can and should, and it will be kept if he's president. And we have work to do. We have to continue building up the Afghan security forces. We all recognize that. Governor Romney is the kind of person who acquires knowledge and understanding about situations and make decisions, but he believes that we can and will keep that 2014 date. There is work that we have to do in the meantime.
Anybody else want to add anything to that? Looks like
I just, again, we started the discussion, how would a Romney administration be different than the current administration? That date was set by for political circumstance, political reasons, not based on advice from commanders on the ground. But as has been said, Governor Romney firmly believes that date can and will be met. But I can assure you that Governor Romney is not going to be using political considerations as the barometer by which he makes decisions of that kind of significance that impact the lives of troops on the ground, that reflect upon the sacrifices that he made. And even when that date was set, one of the realities is you then say, now we're getting out, you announce it publicly, and it makes it much more difficult for those who are on the ground. And by the way, for those who are wondering, okay, now the U.S. is getting out, so what do we do to kind of preserve our interests? Terrible problems with corruption in Afghanistan got worse, and that decision was publicly announced. And so there, again, the difference would be in a Romney administration, he will not be making decisions of that kind of magnitude based on political considerations. There's no question in this country that support for our president of Afghanistan is withered. And decision made, decision we respected, but it's not the way you make a decision.
Let me go to the other side of the Eurasian continent here and ask a question about, actually about the South China Sea. I was struck again in reading the transcript of the 2000 panel discussion that this issue was raised then as one of a potential spot of trouble in the coming years. And we know, of course, very recently there's been a rising amount of conflict regarding this countries maneuver to try to exploit the resources there. What role can the United States, or should the United States, play in trying to resolve this, to reach a peaceful settlement, and yet to show that our national interests are also involved in this?
Well,
I'll let you
yes,
start.
I don't want to hog the
No,
microphone
it's
here. And without getting into the specifics of any particular dispute there, I think it's certainly worthwhile noting that the United States has a growing economic relationship with China, which is a good thing, and I think both countries look to that trend continuing. It doesn't mean, however, in Governor Romney's view, that we should, in any degree whatsoever, reduce or move away from our traditional alliances and friendships in the Pacific, including Japan, South Korea, Australia. These are strong allies who have been partners and friends for years and years, and Governor Romney believes we should reaffirm that friendship and that we should maintain the capabilities so that we can do that. And again, I referred before to his policy towards naval shipbuilding. He's been very clear about that. The Navy has declined, the American Navy has declined to about 286 ships, the lowest in numbers it has been since before World War I. And you cannot maintain credibility without presence, and you can't maintain presence without ships, and Governor Romney believes that. And then what we do is we work with these nations to try and resolve all these disputes in a peaceful way. Nobody is going to dominate or control a region of the world through which so much shipping passes and needs to pass. We have to have freedom of the seas. We have to have international understandings regarding navigation respected. And then we work things out in a peaceful way. But, you know, the United States is not going to back away from that region, not going to back away from presence, and not going to back away from our traditional friendships, and then deal with everybody fairly.
I would add only this to what Jim said. Obviously, we all know China's been growing at double-digit rates for decades now. And throughout that period of time, the United States has always been trying to strengthen its relationship with China, and probably, at least inadvertently maybe, at the expense of the relationships that Jim just talked about with our other longtime allies in the region. I think that was a mistake. But I would make the point, there's now evidence that China's economy is slowing. I think we all agree with that. Their own official projections show it's slowing. It may be slowing considerably more than their official projections. It seems to me that as China encounters some difficulties going forward, we don't wish difficulties on them, but if that's going to be the case, it's more important, not less important, that we strengthen our traditional relationships with all of our longtime friends and allies in the region that Jim mentioned.
Let me turn back then to Russia, to Europe and to Russia. During the campaign, Governor Romney said that he thought that Russia may be our #1 potential enemy. I think he used that word. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Is that correct? Well, I'm not asking you to second guess Governor Romney on this, but what do you think Governor Romney's approach to dealing with President Putin and Russia should be? Rich, let me start with you on that one.
I think it's fair to say that Governor Romney appreciates some of the activities by Moscow which have been confronting U.S. interests, and there's a substantial litany. Whether it is their continued illegal occupation of Georgia and South Ossetia, whether it is Russia's use of energy resources to intimidate the Baltics and countries in Eastern Europe that are free today, whether it's their efforts to crowd the Central Asian countries and make them under their influence, whether it is opposing our efforts on many fronts with respect to stopping Iran's nuclear breakout, whether it is their continued opposition to dealing with the crisis in Syria. And the list goes on. That's a substantial list. Furthermore, you have a grave concern of an authoritarian drift within Russia. An authoritarian drift where Vladimir Putin's reign now is in its 13th year, where the election in March was weighed by the European observers of not being free and fair, where he just introduced further legislation to restrict NGOs, etc. Having said all that, There are areas we can and should work together. But you can do that by being honest about disagreements and also frank about your aspirations long term. President Reagan on June 6, 1982, in his famous speech in Westminster Hall in England said, "We, the United States, cannot determine the pace of the March of Freedom, but there should be no question of our eventual aspiration. We would like to see people everywhere have their human rights protected, have the right for democratic elections, the rule of law, etc. The trend in Russia is in the opposite direction, unfortunately. And on these areas of difference in foreign affairs, look, we understand countries will have legitimate differences, but the illegal occupation of Georgia and South Ossetia is intolerable. The propping up Bashar al-Assad's regime after 17,000 people have died is intolerable. So I would suggest to you that Governor Romney quite correctly pointed out that one of the countries for which we have to recalibrate our approach, be more forceful, be more effective, seek ways to work cooperatively, but be honest where we have differences, is with Moscow. And I think that's important not only for the people of Russia, but for their neighbors.
And Jim, I think I agree completely with Rich. When Governor Romney made the statement he did, the Democrats jumped all over it and tried to say he was trying to restart the Cold War. Nothing could be further from the truth. And Governor Romney actually chose his words very carefully in making that statement. He talked about a geopolitical foe, not a military foe. During the Cold War, of course, the ultimate fear we had from the Russians was that we would end up in a war. That's not what Governor Romney was talking about. He said geopolitical, and all the things that Rich was just talking about are evidence that as much as we might like to have a better relationship with the Russians, as much as we might have liked to reset the relationship in their terms, it hasn't worked. It's hard to think of a country of any standing that has more, that is working more diligently to try to undermine U.S. interests politically and diplomatically around the world.
Okay.
I was going to add, and again, the word is not enemy, but foe. And there's a difference, by the way. We have different interests. Sometimes those interests are in conflict. In regard to the reset, where has the reset gotten us? One of the great mistakes of this administration, in the beginning of the resetting, was when this president pulled the rug out of from underneath our allies, the Poles and the Czech Republic, when it came to missile defense. And clearly that was for the purpose of satisfying the Russians. The whispered comment of President Obama to send a message to Lottie that I need more flexibility in my second term. The reality is that the reset hasn't gotten us anywhere. I think Henry Kissinger said publicly one time that Putin told him, "I want my empire back." Take him at his word. Take him at his word. But so in the end, it gets back to, I think, this common theme that we have here, that your foes respect strength, act with strength. And if you do, in the end, you then avoid conflict. And I think that's a clear reflection of Governor Romney's approach.
I was going to say that. I think Norm said it very well. I mean, the Obama administration has been, I think we will all agree, at the very least, extremely sensitive regarding Russian concerns and feelings and areas of interest. And the fact of the matter is that the government of Russia has responded in area after area after area after area by being completely insensitive to the goals and the interests, not just of the United States, but of very broad coalitions of nations, as for example in Syria. And they just have failed to be cooperative in globally, geopolitically. And this is what Governor Romney is recognizing. And and he is too, a big believer that healing relationships, if you will, or strengthening relationships, begins with being willing to recognize the truth. Let's not be afraid to say the truth. I mean, if these things are really meaningful to the United States and we really want cooperation with Russia in these areas, then we ought to show that by recognizing the truth about what they're doing. And that I think will show them that if we're not willing to recognize the truth, then why should they think we really care about what they're doing?
Okay, let me follow up that more general question with a very specific one. Russia joined the WTO just last week, and bills have been reported out from both the Senate Finance and House Ways and Means Committee to give Russia permanent normal trade relations, that is to lift the sanctions of Jackson-Vanik, without which we don't get the advantages of any trade with Russia. Should or will a candidate, Governor Romney, urge his colleagues in Congress to support this?
Let me just add a qualifier, though. And first of all, the government clearly supports encouraging the world's seventh largest economy to have PNTR with the United States. I don't think there's any question about that. But the bills reported out regarding Jackson-Vanik, at the same time, bills were passed in the Senate.
No, you have the Magnitsky. Yes.
And so I think what you have is that let me just get into the human rights issue, which is kind of has been noted. Both he and I serve on that board, the National Endowment of Democracy. And I can tell you one of the bipartisan concerns has been this administration's lack of robust support for democracy. As a result, in the dark, and on places like Egypt, and this is Norm Coleman speaking, but I think in parts because President Bush talked about democracy, and this administration wasn't talking about it. But you paid a price for that, and we've paid a price. So I think as you reflect on the actions of my colleagues in the Senate, they're looking at PNTR and supporting it at the same time, passed out this month, some things have been issued, we're going to pass that. And so I think you may well see a kind of withdrawal of Jackson-Vanik, but I think you'll see it replaced with, make this a rule of law Accountability Act.
Okay, so but we do move forward with lifting the Jackson-Vanik.
Again, I think there's a replacement with a replacement.
Right.
So the issue of human rights is still an issue. We're not
a trade issue.
It's human rights is still an issue.
Okay.
In our relations with Russia.
Well, speaking of human rights, it's a good moment for me to turn to Rich. I have the privilege of serving on a group on the task force R2P, which is Right to Protect, that he and Madeleine Albright co-chair. Rich, what would Governor Romney's view of humanitarian intervention in R2P be?
Thanks.
Thanks, Congressman, and I should note that Congressman Weber also serves on a group.
I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that.
And also one other correction, Paula Dobriansky, who's also a special advisor on foreign affairs to Governor Romney, is in the audience. So thank you, Paula, for being there. On humanitarian intervention, Governor Romney understands and embraces that the first responsibility of the U.S. government is national security for the American people, to keep them safe. That's in part why he wants to rebuild our defenses. It's good politically, but it's necessary to take care of our first responsibility. He also embraces that there are other vital interests, economic and otherwise, that have to be addressed. But Governor Romney, as he said in his speech last fall in the Citadel, understands that our values should animate our foreign policy, which means having an understanding and compassion for those less able to protect themselves, especially citizens who become the victims of atrocities from their own government. So he believes there should be a response. Let me hasten to add, before Norm Coleman corrects me, that there's a wide range of things you can do to intervene to correct a situation, from assistance to diplomatic to economic sanctions to a wide range of robust actions. So it doesn't mean by any means that you will move toward boots on the ground automatically. But he does think it's shameful to sit on the sidelines, hope for the best, as 17,000 innocent people died in Syria. My friends, last March, 16 months ago, Al-Khatib, a 12-year-old boy in Syria, went to a demonstration against the government. 2 weeks later, he was returned to the doorstep of his parents' home. He was wrapped in plastic. Under the plastic, he was wrapped in a blanket. Under the blanket was his naked body, which had been burned, had been decomposing for 5 days, had been mutilated, and his penis was in his mouth. I don't think it took a genius to figure out that Al Bashir was not going to leave quietly, cooperatively, or because Kofi Annan suggested that'd be a good idea. It was time for the United States to stand up for the opportunity and responsibility it has to lead. Governor Romney embraces that, but again, with the full spectrum of options, beginning with rhetorically saying the truth and standing up for your values, and then using other things such as foreign assistance, such as diplomatic efforts, isolation, such as economic tools to respond. Thank you.
I think it's very well said. And you know, we've been talking about the importance of American leadership within the international community with the broad goal of an international order that is moving in the direction of greater democracy and freedom, and it's not perfect, and we all understand that. And I believe it's a history of the post-war tradition, a number of nations participating in that and committed to that goal. And if there is no room whatsoever, you know, within the councils of those nations and within that international order to take some effective action against gross atrocities and consistent atrocities, it undermines the legitimacy of what all these nations are trying to achieve. Now, again, there's a wide range of potential responses, and you know, you have to adjust, and every nation is operating its own foreign policy, basically for the security and the protection of that particular nation. The United States is no different. It's just that we believe that, and Governor Romney believes that an international community that has room in its councils for trying to do something about these situations is in the interest of the United States. I think he would not ignore as these kinds of atrocities have been ignored.
I've referred a couple of times to the transcript of the 2000 panel of the same nature that took place here. And I'm going to do it again because I was struck in looking at that, at the number of panelists in 12 years ago. It suggested it was time to lift the embargo with Cuba. What do you think? Should we do it? Should President Romney take the Nixon to China stance and do it?
No.
No. That it? Okay.
I'll tell a very, very quick story. I was in Cuba when I went to Cuba in the Senate. I was actually a proponent at that time of expanding trade, expanding a range of things. Went there with a very open mind. Had a meeting in the home of Oswaldo Payá, who started the Varela Project and passed away under perhaps questionable circumstances quite recently. Had actually come under fire in the Cuban community for being advocating ending the embargo. And I sat with him and a group of women who subsequently became the Women in White. They were the wives of folks who put prison for 20, 25 years for things like being Doctors Without Borders, labor organizers, etc. And during the course of this discussion, Payá handed me a piece of paper, and on it he had written, the United States should end its embargo on Cuba when Castro ends his embargo on the Cuban people. This is beyond the politics of it. I kept that to heart. Castro is going to be gone hopefully soon. Hopefully soon. It's been there. It's incredible how long he's been there. And then there'll be opportunity. And by the way, I really hope that our friends in the region, one of the things we haven't touched on Latin America, but Governor Romney clearly tends to have a more robust relationship with our friends and neighbors in Latin America, a much more robust economic relationship. And I would hope that the community in Latin America makes sure that this transition is one in which there is democracy in Cuba. That we don't let this transition somehow be wasted. It's going to happen soon, but at this point, it is there and will be there until Castro's gone.
Well, Norm, you anticipated my next question because I don't want us to be neglecting Latin America. And you were chairman of that subcommittee in the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. And as you say, we do need or want a robust relationship, but there's certainly been some negative signs there with what's happening in Argentina, the faltering Brazilian economy, slowing down significantly, as a lot of other economies are. Ecuador, Bolivia, with Nicaragua, with somewhat varying hostile attitudes towards the United States, and of course Chavez with an election coming up very shortly. What would Governor Romney's position be with regard to Latin America? What do you think we should do? specifically?
The governor has said very clearly that he wants a more robust relationship. He's talked about setting up certain economic opportunities, expanding the economic relationship. The governor comes from a business perspective. He understands the power of jobs. And that issue is as important in Latin America as it is in the United States. In Latin America, there are tremendous resources. The Chinese, by the way, certainly recognize that with an expanded China presence. One of the things that Governor Romney has talked about is the way in which he will make the relationships more effective. And he's talked about, and Jim could probably answer this better or respond to this better than I did, but really looking at what we did from the military side with CENTCOM and SOUTHCOM, and really setting up a person in each region who would have the ability to coordinate the various programs that we have, various aid programs and other things. We're going to work aggressively to make them more effective. But also have somebody with some responsibility. Say, are we getting it done? Are we making a difference? The reality is that under this administration, and somewhat for some other reasons in the last administration, that there has not been a focus on our friends and neighbors in Latin America. Look at the challenges in the world. You've got the European Union, you've got China growing at a certain rate, you've got India, got Russia with resources. We really need our friends and allies. And if you would think about the combined power of American capital, American innovation, Latin American resources, you add Central America, that makes Mexico, Canada, as the Americans as a region really have great potential. And I think Governor Romney fully recognizes that and is committed to figuring out ways to maximize that.
Governor Romney is a big believer in the civilian tools of national influence and in developing them and making them robust and operating seamlessly with the rest of our foreign policy, and certainly trade and assistance that is actually effective on the ground in helping other countries create jobs and working with them. Latin America would be a tremendous partner in that, in his view, as part of that. And actually, both in the last campaign and this one, he's written about that. And Norm mentioned how the American military is organized around the world. I mean, Governor Romney's written and talked about trying, in some respect, to organize our civilian agencies in the same way, so that we're able to operate in a partnership way in different parts of the world. And I think it'll be much more effective in strengthening our relationships and in these parts of the world, because there'll be people on the ground that you can deal with who are really empowered. That's basically an internal American government organization thing, but that's how Governor Romney thinks. He's very open to new ideas, to new strategies, and very hands-on as well. And so I would agree with everything Norm said.
And I would add just one thing, that it was it was a shame that this administration had to be forced to move forward on Colombia and Panama. And they have to be forced. It's a shame. Our greatest ally in the region, and really a country that's been transformed, Colombia, beginning with President Uribe and carried through with President Santos, for us to kind of, in effect, kind of put the cast them aside and make them go through what we had to go through, ultimately get that passed, I think was not a shining moment for this administration.
It would probably never have happened if the Republicans hadn't taken control of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, they never would have submitted.
Well, let me ask one more question before we go to the questions from the audience here. And this is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart as somebody who's worked in the area of development, economic development and foreign assistance programs. A lot is being said these days about the need for a greater use in our limited resources, the greater use of soft power, diplomacy, democracy promotion, development assistance that's effective, and using these widely as tools of national security policy. But the Ryan budget did propose some substantial cuts to foreign assistance programs. And,
I think most of us at this table know that the development of what we used to think of as third world countries, the underdeveloped countries, is increasingly being propelled by private sector investment, not government funding. It's not that there's no role for government, there is, but the private sector, companies like Coca-Cola and others are doing far more to lift people out of poverty in the Southern Hemisphere and other parts of the world than government assistance from our country or anybody else in the world. So it's possible for us to achieve our objectives and still play a leading role in the world with a constrained budget. But I do think you have to be careful about that.
Okay. Well, any other comments on that?
look, what we should say, what Vin said is absolutely correct. Remember, the overall goal is to try and anticipate areas and risks that may arise that would be inimical to America's security. And the tools of assistance can be very useful in preventing that at a very low cost to the American taxpayer. There's always a question of what's the option, what's the alternative, what's likely to happen if we don't do that. Now, it has to be linked to our foreign policy. We owe it to the people to do that. So we can say, this is why you should sleep better at night because we're doing this. This is why and you have to demand accountability and results. I mean, so the classic old foreign aid, which is, you know, the public thinks of throwing money at something with no accountability and no results. No, and Mitt Romney's not that kind of guy. He's going to demand that these various aid packages produce results along the line of the millennial challenge.
That's perhaps a good segue then.
And if I can just say one thing, and again, in these tough economic times, everything's going to get under the microscope and everything's going to have to be trimmed, but we do have to do a better job of reminding the American public that foreign assistance is 1% of our budget, and because I think people have an inflated view of what they think that we're spending. But again, within the framework that we talked about, Governor Romney will bring a business-like approach to making sure that the foreign assistance does further American interest, and that's a good thing.
I used to say, only half jokingly, the average American thinks that the budget's about 80% foreign aid and the rest is congressional salaries.
That's not too far off, actually, from the truth there of what they think, that is. But this last question and your response is a good segue into the first question from the audience. And while I won't generally be identifying people, this comes from the ambassador from Bangladesh who is in the audience here with us, and he asks, would there be a departure from President Obama's development initiatives, such as climate change, feed the future, global health, in Mitt Romney's foreign policy priorities? Rich, or who else to take that?
I just comment that I think one of the things we can be impressed by is President Obama's initiatives in agricultural sustainability in Africa, Southeast Asia, trying to empower local producers. But I think the governor has said, in the context of getting results, that certain foreign aid will be conditional, which means that it'll be reviewed, not presumed, year from year. That things like the Millennium Challenge account that demands externalities shift. Who is a turnaround specialist? Who is trained to analyze the data? Who wants results? And in that regard, it's going to be a new, more business-like approach, and the American people should be taking comfort from that. And those recipients of foreign aid who can respond with real results should welcome it, because it means you're going to be higher in the ladder and be able to get greater assistance from the United States. Those that have squandered, not used it, not dealt with rule of law, not dealt with allowing direct foreign investment and other factors, you'll have less of a claim. But beyond that, beyond those guidelines, nobody can say. But I think the impulse, as my colleagues have said, is a recognition that foreign assistance is a good and useful instrument in America's foreign policy toolbox, but we can do better.
Okay, we're going to go with some other questions, and let me remind my panel, these aren't my questions. I didn't draw them up, so if you don't like them particularly, here, don't blame me for these here. But I think what we'll do is try to just have one answer, and if somebody really needs to follow up too with their own response, that's fine. But I'd like to get through as many of them as possible, and these are going to be kind of random in the way they're organized here. This one is a very specific one. What would President Romney's administration do regarding deep erosion of democracy and growing authoritarianism in Ukraine under the Yanukovych government? Who's our Europe specialist? Vin? No, none of you. Okay. Anybody? Rich?
I think as we've seen the transition of former countries that were part of the Soviet Empire, there have been fits and starts as they've gotten their sea legs and moved ahead. And there are many who are concerned that some of the progress initially made in Ukraine has resulted more recently in some retrenchment. I know the International Republican Institute is very active in Ukraine. I believe the National Democratic Institute is active in Ukraine. It's an area of great interest, both because of its geography and historic role, but also because of the Orange Revolution and the enthusiasm that went there. It was an example for the world. It can and should be successful. It has elections coming up. The next ones are in late October. The United States will be deeply involved, both IRI and NDI, bipartisan, in trying to follow it, trying to work with civil society. I'd say we're hopeful, but cautious.
Okay, let me, another very specific question here. In a Romney administration, will Taiwan, the Republic of China, be allowed to purchase modern weapons and arms needed for its self-defense?
When President Obama refused to sell the F-16 CDs to Taiwan, Governor Romney was very clear in his statement. He disagreed with that decision. The last time the United States has agreed to sell sophisticated arms to the Republic of China was President George H.W. Bush. The sales being complete a few years later into the Clinton administration. The Republic of China has been and remains a friend. Governor Romney understands and embraces the Taiwan Relations Act.
He agrees with the Taiwan Relations Act, the juridical arrangement, the policy that's going back for decades, and believes there should be a peaceful resolution of disputes, and that's supporting Taiwan with arms sales of the kind that you talked about is an advancement of that policy.
All right, another very specific question, and I'll remind my panel they can decline to answer if they choose here. Should President Romney move our embassy in Israel to Jerusalem without delay?
As I said to a group yesterday at APAC, President Romney will enjoy the beautiful view of the Mediterranean in Tel Aviv as he travels to the capital in Jerusalem.
I was going to add that there's no question that President Romney understands that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel.
Okay. This question is about energy and Canada. I can guess that it may have come from somebody from Canada. America gets a significant percent of its energy from Canada, yet the United States does not seem to pay a lot of attention to Canada or even handle minor trade issues with seriousness. How would President Romney handle Canada differently than President Obama does?
Well, I think, first of all, coming from Minnesota, I don't even think of Canada as a foreign country.
Well, Canadians love to hear that. Maybe not.
No inference about Canadian sovereignty. It was just a little facetious remark. But I do think that Governor Romney's emphasis on North American energy independence, and he's very careful when he talks about it. For years and years, we've had American politicians of both parties talk about energy independence. The governor is more specific in his choice of language. He always talks about North American energy independence. That's because it's possible. You know, for many, many years, talk of energy independence, but it really was a fantasy. But now, because of technology and other developments, we have a chance at least strategic North American energy independence. But it's absolutely dependent on our having a stronger, more vibrant relationship with the Canadians. First thing to do is build the damn pipeline, pardon me. But also a longer, ongoing, stronger relationship with our friends to the north and to the south.
I really want to add on this, Jim, that the question is very relevant. I would urge people in the audience, if they have not done so, to go on the website and read Governor Romney's recent proposals regarding energy. They're extremely dynamic, and of all of his economic policies, possibly the single most consequential. He believes that we can have practical North American energy independence. The Wall Street Journal didn't like the term he used, but by that he meant that we can produce so much between the partners in North America that equivalent to what we are now importing. The United States is now importing from OPEC countries. The vast majority of Canadian and Mexican exports already go to the United States. So yes, approve the Keystone Pipeline, but that's just the beginning. Governor Romney has a whole section in that about how we can streamline regulations so to improve and more quickly build the kind of infrastructure that we need between the United States and Canada to facilitate this kind of an energy relationship. And the impact on all the countries will be tremendously positive. You know, we estimate 3 to 4 million jobs in the United States created alone by these energy policies, and the geopolitical impact tremendous as well. And we recognize, Governor Romney recognizes in these policies that the Canadians have led the way in this. If you look at his report, his proposals for reform of leasing and permitting regulations in the United States and the Western lands, they follow the model that the Canadians have developed and blazed a trail on to the north. So he's very grateful and very enthusiastic about the potential of this relationship, both the north and the south.
I wouldn't want to let this, thank you for the answer, I wouldn't want to let this go by without turning to our southern neighbor, so I'll interject my own question in this southern border neighbor here in Mexico. How should we restructure, or should we restructure our foreign policy with regard to Mexico, our strategic relationship with them, particularly vis-a-vis immigration? Two things: immigration and the the war on drugs. Is there anything that you would do that's different from today, or do you think Governor Romney will have a different approach to these?
Immigration is, as I'm sure our audience understands, a very contentious issue in this country, but in many ways it's really not a complex issue. And when I say it's not complex, almost all Americans would agree that we have to have stronger border security, and it's been the lack of belief in America's commitment to that border security that has in many ways made it difficult than to solve the ongoing problem. America is a country that has been made great by immigration. It's kind of recharges our batteries. And so Governor Romney is strongly committed to legal immigration, strongly committed to getting a system that works, because the system simply doesn't work today. And so if you combine strict, tough border enforcement, if you combine fixing up the system that works, then I think folks can figure out a way to deal with the problem we have with those folks here who are undocumented. And that's become a complex issue, but I think it's more solvable if we can do A and B. And I really do think those things can be done, and Governor Romney is deeply committed. You know, we talk about energy, and Mexico is an energy partner. It's part of, you know, this concept of, you know, North American energy is really important. We, by the way, we're players in that also. North Dakota, our neighbor, a tremendous, you know, opportunity in the pocket deposits there. This administration has cut off a lot of development in the Gulf Coast. I was in Israel not too long ago on a rig 85 miles off the coast of Haifa, in which they got natural gas at 5,000 feet, looking at oil at 20,000 feet. Most of the workers were from Louisiana, Texas, in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. That's where most of the folks are from, because they couldn't get jobs in the Gulf Coast. So, bottom line is, Mexico is a tremendous energy partner for us. We have to deal with the immigration issue. And the challenge, certainly one of the great challenges, is the drug challenge. We had a Plan Colombia that worked. Plan Colombia was very, very effective. And I think we have to figure out a way to kind of work with our Mexican friends and our neighbors to help them more effectively deal with the drug problem. Part of it is our demand side of it, which we understand, and part of it is some of the things that they need that we have to be committed to. So an important partner, and we can't turn our back on our neighbors in the region, a constructive partner in this energy kind of retooling of our relationship and ending that dependency on Middle East oil, and a strong economic partner. Both Canada and Mexico are strong economic partners. NAFTA, it didn't result in what was Perot worried about, Great Sucking Sound, and you know, coming from a state like Minnesota, we understand that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I do think that for a lot of reasons, as I said, the Bush administration got very focused because of necessity on the Middle East after 9/11. But there really has been, unfortunately, in this administration, you don't see much in terms of our southern neighbors. I'm going to speak again, Norm Coleman speaking. I thought the president was received with very little respect in Cartagena, and in part because perhaps he didn't earn it. Perhaps he didn't earn it. But I was struck by the kind of, it was almost as if he was ignored. And the president of the United States shouldn't be ignored. you know, in a meeting of our neighbors. And so kind of pulling it together, strengthening the economic relationship in Latin America, strengthening the energy and economic relationships in Mexico, and working more closely with our neighbors and friends in Canada on maximizing energy resources.
The best way, Governor Romney, is the best way you dispel, you know, the darkness and the issues is you light a candle. In other words, there are elements in Latin and South America which have not been respectful of America's interests. And, the best way to deal with that is to move aggressively in a robust way to build up partnerships with other countries, and this energy policy of his is a great foundation for doing it.
All right, well, let me ask one other question, a couple on development and on Africa, and then we're going to come to a concluding question. But this one asks, what would the Romney administration do with the pivot to Asia and the Pacific policy that President Obama announced several months ago, actually a year ago? Would there be any difference with the Obama administration on this?
Well, I think the word pivot was unfortunate. It has caused some alarm among friends of ours in Europe and elsewhere who worry about resources being shifted. Having said that, part of this is the inevitable recalibrations as rising powers are reality with China, with India, with Brazil, with others. We have to make recalibrations in our foreign policy, and again, Governor Romney's been so clear about this. We look to our interests, and among the first steps is rebuilding relationships with our friends and allies. And that means politically collaborating, as Jim Talon has mentioned, militarily coordinating, and sharing candid discussions about the adjustments that can and should be made and must be made. So should the United States have greater naval capacity in the Pacific Rim, especially after the events in the Yellow Sea and the South China Sea? Absolutely. Must the United States devote more to the economic relationship with China, with Korea, with the Republic of China, with Japan, with India? Absolutely. But at the same time, if we're going to be successful, as the United States has been during the American century, the Atlantic Alliance is the bedrock of our engagement in the world. A successful relationship with our American allies is required. So yes, the U.S. has to adjust to new realities, but if we're too quick to take for granted or be cavalier or turn our backs or undercut those who share our values, those who share our history, and those who share our interests and our traditional allies, we would be reckless, irresponsible, and fail. And Governor Romney understands this, and he's going to approach this in a business-like, systematic way to respond to the new realities, the new opportunities, while still embracing the friendships and alliances that have helped make us great.
I would only add to Rich's very eloquent statement. This problem is made worse or more difficult by the declining defense budgets. Some of that's necessary because we've got a serious budget problem, but it will be made catastrophically worse if this sequester that's coming down the pike actually takes effect. And it's really shameful the President of the United States has not acted forcefully to prevent that from happening.
Well, how can you critique a pivot to Asia when you don't know what it is, because the administration's never given bones to this so-called change in policy? And I'm just very frank about it. I think it's a fig leaf to cover an abandonment of our leadership role in our traditional allies in other parts of the world. Since when has the United States been unable to pay sufficient attention to all parts of the world at the same time? It's not that great a burden. And how can you say you're pivoting to Asia at the same time as you're cutting the rate of naval shipbuilding, which Bob Gates wanted to, you're cutting it by about 20%, and to a level, a rate which if it's continued means the Navy declines another 30 or 40 ships. I mean, that's not consistent with. So this is This is not a thought-out policy. It certainly doesn't reflect what Governor Romney's going to do. I mean, I think a Romney foreign policy walks and chews gum at the same time, which means pay sufficient attention to our alliances, our interests, and the interests of the world and peace and freedom around the globe.
I can just add, we've talked so much about Asia, we talk about China, talk about South China Seas. We haven't mentioned Australia, who is our great ally. And certainly if there's to be a rebuilding of American military capacity and presence in the region, Australia is going to be a significant partner in that, and we shouldn't ignore that.
Well, let me conclude with one question about another region we really haven't talked about, and the question asks, it says the panel hasn't said anything about Africa. That may be my problem that I haven't asked the questions about it, but the question is, does Governor Romney have any plans on how to relate with the African countries? Anybody want to comment on Africa?
I just came back from Liberia very recently, and a trip with one, a country that's in great challenges but has tremendous leadership. Africa is I know one of the questions that we may get asked is kind of the future, what's happening in the future, and Africa may well be the future. The resources are tremendous. Challenges, though, are great. Challenges are really significant. So it's not going to be ignored. Certainly, there are stability challenges that are immense, that are unique. Responses, we always talk about the government, but what you can't ignore and shouldn't ignore the capacity of the private sector, the American private sector, global private sector, being partners in redevelopment and expanding opportunities. So I think there are, as resources, as the resource needs for all of us become greater as we move forward, Africa provides a land of opportunity, and how we embrace that remains to be seen, but certainly not to be ignored.
I would just point out, it's no secret that during the Bush administration, America's standing, at least in public opinion around the world, declined in most places. The big exception to that was sub-Saharan Africa, where perceptions of the United States improved markedly throughout the Bush years, in no small measure because of his AIDS and malaria initiatives. And I think it's safe to say that Governor Romney understands that was really a Republican administration's accomplishment, wants to build on that and a big proper respect to it, and help continue to build a stronger relationship in Africa. I also think Africa becomes more important to us because of resource competition with the Chinese. That's a very practical consideration, but it's one that's only going to grow.
This administration has been plagued with a lot of leaks, national security leaks. Rich, would you like to comment on this, or anybody else? Quickly, and we'll go to a final question.
It's been 32 years since I was in President Reagan's senior staff, and 30 years since my first ambassadorship. And I've seen a lot of mistakes by the United States. I've seen some failures, but I would say the most shameful act I've seen in those years have been recent intelligence leaks by the Obama administration. The leaks with respect to cyber attacks in Iran threw a friend of ours under the bus and gave vital assets and intelligence resource information to our friends and foes through the New York Times. The intelligence leaks about the drone program where the president sits in the Oval Office with David Axelrod in the room picking who will live and die. All, it would appear, to try to make the president look stronger, are a disgrace and shameful. And going to 2 U.S. attorneys to do an investigation is a nice halfway step, but the President of the United States should have a special counsel. He should publicly say that anyone who works for him should waive any confidentiality agreements with the media and allow the media to reveal sources. And he should say publicly that the White House staff will release their phone logs and other information. If the president was committed to get to this cancer and cut it out, it could be done. If the president wanted it to just drag out and get a placeholder to after the election, he'd have done what he has done, and it's a shame.
Thank you very much for that response. Let me conclude with one final question. I kind of tipped my hand beforehand when we were talking about this that I'd ask each of you to respond to this. And that is what we call the known unknowns. When we did this panel 12 years ago, nobody predicted a 9/11, nor could anybody have been expected to predict such a thing. So what is the one event that might occur in the next year or two, the first part of a Romney administration, that we're not thinking about, we haven't talked about here this afternoon? What might be the one thing you'd say, let's be watching this, and we'll start at that end and work this way?
I would say the election of Capriles in Venezuela, the end of the Chavez reign, and then what I would call a Latin spring, and changes then perhaps in Ecuador and in Bolivia and other places that moderate, centrist, even center-right, capital-based, market-based governments take over, lift up the poverty level, and see a great revival in Latin America, but starting with perhaps Capriles election this year.
So positive.
I'm an optimist. I'm looking for positive. I'm saying, what's the negative thing going to happen? I think there's some positive things on the horizon.
Jim.
Well, that was so positive. I feel like what I'm going to say is a downer. I chaired a commission, or co-chaired a commission with former Senator Bob Graham on weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, and terrorism. And based on the intelligence and the people that we talked to at the time, we oriented the work of the commission towards the danger of a bio attack on the United States. And we believe that the danger of that was higher than is generally recognized within the political community, and that there are steps we need to take in order to prepare the country to prevent it and to harden ourselves. Obviously, hope and pray it does not happen, but it is a real concern, and one that your question was getting at, what's out there that we're not thinking about, that we should be thinking about, and I think more thought and leadership should be devoted to dealing with the bio threat.
Thank you. Vin.
That's a good answer. I'm going to give a positive answer too. I think that Governor Romney is going to deal with the country's economic problems seriously, with the long-term budget issue seriously. And if I can probably badly paraphrase a comment that I know you're all familiar with, from the Australian foreign minister, America is just, in his words, just one budget deal away from reestablishing our preeminence in the world financially. I think that's going to happen in the Romney administration. I think all the pessimism, the talk of decline, the problems that we're facing economically can be turned around maybe much more dramatically than anybody thinks. And that would be a positive thing, not just for us, but for the whole world.
Sorry, we didn't get more time to talk about that particular issue as it relates to our security and national defense. Rich, I guess you get the last word here on what to be watching for.
I think having spent a lot of time in my career in Sudan, Eastern DRC, and similar regions, to me in Africa there's one arc of concern and also one of promise. The arc of concern is a terrorist band from Somalia through Sudan all the way over to Mali, which is developing, that has to be addressed by those countries individually, by the African Union, and by like-minded countries that want to confront this growing terrorist threat. On the good side, having spent that time in these regions, I believe that Africa is also on the precipice of a renewal because of the technology they're benefiting from economically, not only from agricultural sustainability, but more sophisticated technology because of the enthusiasm of the people and the empowerment they're feeling today. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that Africa is going to be entering a decade of growth, opportunity, and partnership, which will help the people there and create greater stability in the world.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes our panel. Regardless of what you think about the outlook of this election or who should win it, I hope you will agree with me that Governor Romney has four very articulate, well-spoken, and very thoughtful advisors on foreign policy. Please join with me in giving them a round of applause.